Hi, I'm Tony.
I'm Patrick.
Welcome to another episode of Cave to the Cross Apologetics. We are working our way through Scott Christensen's book on evil, right? What about evil? A defense of God's sovereign glory. And now we began last time looking at this kind of pinnacle chapter 9 where he deals with some of these. He begins to give us his answers to some of the issues that he's raised earlier in the book, right? And, for instance, if indeed God is sovereign over all of his creation and he does all of these decrees, then why isn't God responsible for evil, right? And so that's the name of this chapter, the challenge of moral responsibility, right? Is God responsible for the evil? And we've looked at, various arguments to show that, the origin of evil has to do with the intentions of our hearts, our motives, our desires. And of course, God doesn't have evil desires, whereas we do. And so that's a big, issue in this chapter, and a way that he uses to help him to defend, the claim that God isn't morally responsible. We are, right? He uses the analogy of an author, right? That, Shakespeare writes this book, and yet, we wouldn't say that Shakespeare does the action in the book, right? The characters do the action. And so there's a kind of a two-tiered causal mechanism going on, right? The ultimate, the primary cause, and then the secondary cause. Right. And he suggests that's the way, at least to a certain degree, right? Not perfectly, but to a certain degree, that's the way it works with regard to God.
It's a real practical world application that we constantly do. If we're watching a TV show and we're like, or reading a comic book, oh, Lex Luthor is so bad, but Superman is so good. And so we attribute those qualities to the character, but we don't go, oh, well, Eisner is the one that writes Superman really well. He does the action of Superman really well. And so I really like that. We talk about good quality writing, but sometimes one of the things that Zack Snyder was poo-pooed against was because Batman kills people. Batman doesn't kill people. That's one of his characters. It's outside the scope of Batman's character to kill people. Well, here's how I wrote it, and here's how I thought of the characters, is what Snyder would say. Yeah. But we have those attributions of good quality writing, but we don't say that they're the ones that do the action. Right. So there's
the writer isn't the one that's doing the action; it's the character that's doing the action. And so, and so, he uses this to kind of help him to, deflect and, in fact, answer this issue of moral responsibility. And again, he talks about good intentions and that God has good intentions. And so this next section then in the chapter has to do with compatibilism and moral responsibility. Right. He says biblical compatibilism, that is the compatibility of divine and human choosing, what God chooses, what we chooses, helps us, he tells us, to sort out where moral responsibility lies. While God authors the plot, as it were, in which evil takes place for his good purposes, it is only secondary agents who bear the moral culpability, right, the blameworthiness for the evil that God decrees. So God does not act on behalf of the choosing agent. The agent himself or herself deliberately, willingly, voluntarily acts without any divine coercion. Right. God isn't forcing it. It's coming out of the evil desires of the person's heart.
This is the puppeteer. He's not puppeteering. He's not entering into this person, making them robotically move to his will.
They're doing it out of their own heart's desires, right? So God can never, he says, be the efficient cause of evil. It's not the transcendent God who sins, right? God isn't sinning when I do something. It's the creaturely agent who intends evil and then acts on those evil intentions, right?
So I think one of the biggest and best illustrations of this is in Genesis with the story of Joseph. And we saw this as a big factor in his other book, What About Free Will? And he says, for instance, in the story of Joseph, there is a dual explanation for Joseph's being sold into slavery. His brothers did the deed. They sold his brother into captivity, but God stood behind their action. In fact, it says that God restrained them from killing him. They wanted to kill him, but then brother comes along and says, no, let's not do that. That would be bad. I know. Let's just sell him into slavery away from it, and then let's lie to our father that he was dead.
Yeah.
way better.
Yeah.
His brothers did the deed, but God stood behind their actions. God is the primary agent, while they are secondary agents. Both intended the evil to take place, but they have different culpabilities, responsibilities there. The difference lies in the internal desires that birthed their intentions. For Joseph's brothers, their actions were born of a hateful motive. They meant evil. What you intended for evil, for God, though the evil could be born of nothing other than a good motive, because that's who he is. He's transcendent, his characteristic. He doesn't have a sin nature, and so he only has, by that logic, a good motive to deliver his chosen people from certain doom. What they intended for evil, God meant it for good.
Right. So again, this issue of intention is doing a lot of work for him here, right? The fact that we intend to do evil, to disobey God, and to act contrary to what he wants, that's makes us morally responsible for what we do, right? Because what we do is coming out of our evil intentions. God, on the other hand, when he decrees an evil action, isn't first morally responsible for it because the creatures do it. But second, he isn't evil because he has good intentions, right? He doesn't have an evil heart. He doesn't have evil motives, right? So that's where.
So this has a tremendous practical importance. It causes us to realize that evil does not occur independently. It has no power of its own. No evil, no demon, no satanically inspired scheme can surprise God escaping his notice. Again, it's not God and Satan having an arm wrestling match over the earth. It's the devil is God's devil. We're God's evil creation that he redeems. Furthermore, no evil scheme exists outside of his all-powerful hand or his all-wise and all-good purposes. And finally, the perpetrator of sin can never say, God made me do this, as though he were being forced against his will. God effectively ensures his sin, but God emphatically did not sin his sin, no more than Shakespeare sins of the sins of Macbeth. The only sin that exists is that which exists in the heart of the willful perpetrator.
Right, exactly. So God doesn't do the sin, right? The individual does the sin. And so the individual is culpable, is the one to be blamed, right? And so now we have what he's struggling with here, or not struggling, but what he's trying to help us see here is the compatibility here,
right?
The compatibilist position, where our free will can be compatible with God's decrees and God's, carrying out what he wants to accomplish, right? And so he says there's no conflict then between human choosing and divine choosing, between human freedom and divine freedom. There's no conflict between primary and secondary causation. Between the plot that the divine author writes and the actors who willingly carry it out. Furthermore, he says God is free to sovereignly will that which his moral will has commanded us not to do. Right? Therefore, when his creatures willingly transgress his clear moral will written on their hearts, Romans chapter 2, in service of his secret and sovereign will, they will bear the demands of his irreproachable justice. In the end, he tells us, reconciling God's meticulous sovereignty with the matrix of divine and human freedom, and particularly moral responsibility, is not the insurmountable task that so many detractors have suggested.
Right. So he's using a means to get to the ends. He declares the means as well as the ends, and so. I was trying to think of an analogy for this, and so I said, God uses sinful men to accomplish his purpose. That's the desire. And so this is like a king utilizing his troops to go to war. But you know who he wouldn't use? He wouldn't use the maidens, the noblemen, the farmers. He would use the military. And so God is accomplishing his goals with the appropriate troops. Sinful men. Right. So he's able to do that. He's not sinning. He's not the the person that's carrying out the war, he's decreeing that it will happen by these people. So again, all analogies break down, but that's how I kind of envisioned it with me. So moving on to the enigma of the fall. And so here's the hardest part, because the answer is, I don't know. It's kind of a mystery.
Yeah. This one is tough, right?
Yeah.
And as a good philosopher, he realizes that there's some problems with his particular position. And so here he's going to at least attempt to address the main big problem with his position, right?
So of all the questions concerning the existence of evil, every single one, however, none is more perplexing than that of the primeval origins. What is ultimately responsible for the emergence of evil in the perfectly good world of our freshly created parents, Adam and Eve? Man was not created as a blank slate, equally poised between good and evil. And that's Pelagian era. Heresy, you get killed for that. And what
back in the day,
back in the day. Now it's probably you probably create a college off of it. So the Pelagian era would undercut the goodness of God's creation. This tabula rasa. It's you have the ability to choose between the two. You're this blank slate, and there are big issues with that. But
we're all born like that. We don't have original sin. That's the Pelagian.
I mean that's a big one.
Right.
But if humans were created in a state of moral purity, well, then how could they have so easily fallen into sin? Right. So if it's out of our desires that moves us, and we have evil desires, well, what about the people that didn't start with evil desires?
That didn't have an evil heart, that didn't have a wicked heart. How did they sin? Right. That's the issue that he calls the enigma of the fall. Right.
And no one has thought about this issue. No one, the reformers didn't write about it for 500 years. It's not currently being written about. So if you think you have well, what about this one? It has at least been discussed, and it hasn't detracted completely from the idea that is out there as
actually
well.
They have, and they've dealt with this and tried to work through it. He gives us actually several ways to try to overcome this one. He talks about, he says the standard Christian response to the question of evil's origin is that Adam and Eve possess libertarian free will before the fall. So that's one way, right? But he says Reformed thought affirms that the first couple indeed had free will, but not necessarily libertarian free will. Most Reformed accounts of pre-fall freedom are commensurate with compatibilism, right? So it was a both and with regard to God. He says, for instance, Augustine's dictum that pre-fall Adam was able to sin and able not to sin. And he says most Reformed thinkers have affirmed point like this, right? He looks at the Reformed theologian MacLeod, and he states that Adam's choice was foreordained as a free act, not caused by any prior event or circumstance within the causal nexus, right? So MacLeod here attempts to deal with this. He looks at, another Reformed compatibilist account of freedom that we have, that he defended. He says compatibilism, this is kind of where he's going here. So he's given us several ways to attempt to deal with this, right? And he says, so the Reformed compatibilist account of freedom that, he's been defending doesn't automatically solve this problem, right? Compatibilism, he says, indicates that our actions arise from the state of our nature. We do what flows out of our evil hearts, right? Which in turn give rise to the particular desires and motives that determine the direction of our choices. A perfectly good nature, Adam and Eve, we would think, pre-fall.
It's fine. Just leave them out there.
That's right. Produces perfectly good desires, which produce perfectly good choices. Likewise, a corrupt nature produces corrupt desires and choices. So if no defective internal condition could have possibly predisposed Adam and Eve to act contrary to their good nature, then what did? Right? And again, that's the issue, right? If indeed sin comes out of an evil nature, it comes out of the heart, which is predisposed to sin against God as a result of Adam and Eve's sin, Well, what about Adam and Eve who didn't have that heart initially? Where then did their predisposition to sin come from? Right?
So this seems to point us to a troublesome thought that, given the Reformed doctrine of divine sovereignty, God was the direct cause of Adam and Eve's sin. Here's where he plays the puppet master and forces the fruit into their mouth.
Got him.
Yeah.
And so he's responsible, right?
Note that we cannot simply resort to the notion that they were deceived by the satanically inspired serpent, which is certainly true, for this simply pushes the question back to how Satan, created in a state of goodness himself, could have fallen without an antecedent corrupt nature moving him in that direction.
Right, so it just pushes the issue back, right?
Well, who made everyone on Earth? Aliens. Okay, well, who made the aliens?
Yeah.
Well, bigger aliens. Yeah. Aliens all the way down.
And so he says Reformed thinking cannot revert even to, this what we've seen here, libertarian free will as an explanation of Adam and Eve's sinful choice, since libertarianism must entertain indeterminism, that is the idea that they could choose anything without a basis, right?
Yeah.
And so
Apart
we don't
from
want
God
that.
as well.
Yeah. So libertarianism necessarily rules out, as you said, God's determination of what Adam chooses to do. Such freedom is incompatible with a God who decrees and providentially ensures that the fall take place. So
and not just take place, but before the foundation of the world. That was the plan. That's what he was going to do. That's what in the triune Godhead was determined. And there are good discussions on sonship and the eternity of that that comes about from issues like this. But it happened not as God was looking at Adam going, is he going to? Is he going to? Oh, man, I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay, Jesus, you're on. In 4,400 years... go.
Yeah. So that's the idea of libertarianism, right? This indeterminism. You don't know. God doesn't know what they're going to do, and he has to kind of react and, that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah. So Bavinck suggests, and I really like this quote. I got a lot of good ideas from this. So he says the possibility of sinning is from God. The idea of sin was first conceived in his mind. God eternally conceived sin in his absolute polar opposite, and thus, in that sense, included it in his decree, or else it would never have been able to arise and exist in reality. That's the necessariness of that idea. Mm-hmm. It flows from what's been presented of God in this perspective. It was not Satan, it wasn't Adam and Eve, who first conceived the idea of sin. God himself, as it were, made it visible to their eyes by means of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the probationary command. He clearly showed human beings the two roads that they could take. And before the fall, he even permitted an evil power from without to insinuate itself into paradise. This is, of course, Satan, using the snake as the medium, and to discuss with Eve the meaning and of the probationary command. There is therefore no doubt that God willed the possibility of sin. So again, this is not something outside of God that enters in. This wasn't an unknown quality. This is what he wanted and used and was able to bring about. And again, when we talk about author, go back to that idea of how we think about authorship. So God is not the one doing the sin. He's the one that's decreeing it.
Exactly.
It's different.
And so he says when Bavinck talks about God, will the possibility of sin, he thinks that Bavinck is still being too cautious here, right? God did not merely will the possibility of sin, he willed its eventuality, right? And so there are several things to note about this condition that he wants us to be aware of, that God set forth to ensure that the fall would take place, right? What did God do to ensure that his decrees would be carried out? Well, first, he placed the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the midst of the garden, testing our first parents with the, probationary command. So that was kind of,
just remove it.
Yeah, right.
Sin is solved. Don't make the decree.
He says there's nothing, that suggests the tree was inherently evil, right? Yeah. That it would defy the goodness of God's creation. But why place the tree there? Why not make every tree, freely edible without consequences? Mm-hmm. Well, clearly God was setting something up here, right?
Right. So this isn't a surprise. This is something that God seems to have premeditated.
Yeah.
A second, God could have easily prevented the serpent from slithering into the garden to tempt Adam and Eve, or walking.
Yeah.
Slithering came later. Yeah. After all, he later set cherubim in place to prevent the first couple from re-entering the garden after they had sinned. Why not cut off temptation at the pass? While we cannot speculate about the secret counsels of God, one wonders whether an undisclosed conversation ensued between God and Satan, such as occurred concerning Job. Satan entered into it and said,
God said, look at my perfect creation. Yeah, Adam and Eve, right? And Satan says, well, I can make them sin.
Right. And God says, yes, you can. Go
for it.
Yeah. In which God initiated the calamity that befell the righteous man through the evil machinations of Satan.
Right. So God didn't have to put the tree there. He could have prevented the serpent from coming in. Third, God could have constituted man with a nature that precluded the possibility of sinning, right? The sort of nature that, he will have in our glorified state in heaven, right? Once we're glorified, we then don't sin anymore, right? We're changed, we're glorified, we're different creatures, right?
And we're a people group saved by God's adding to us His righteousness. It's not something that's inherently in us that we're able to be saved and perfected. God has to enter our hearts. He has to change it. And He has to set His Spirit in us. So he's doing a more powerful work than us just being good throughout all of humanity's history. He's even more glorified in this because He's taking something broken and reforming it, and
made it better.
He's taking a people group following our father Satan and adopting us as sons and daughters so that we can call Christ our first born brother. I mean, that's an amazing thing. That's an even greater work than just, we didn't eat from the tree. All right. Good job, guys.
Yeah, way to go.
Yeah, hit the showers.
He says in Augustinian language, we would say that humans will be fully redeemed and glorified creatures who are not able to sin ever again, right? And so he says it would appear from these facts alone, right? The fact that here's the tree, don't eat of it, right? And here's the snake. Well, actually, don't listen to him, or I made you perfect. You can't sin. No, God didn't do any of that stuff, right? No, it would have. Yeah, right.
There's nothing that necessitates that he had to not do that.
Right. And so he says it would appear from these facts alone that God deliberately intended the fall to take place, right? But he says, does this then mean that he was a direct cause of the first sin, right?
Well, what we can say with confidence is this: what Adam and Eve did, they did of their own accord, willingly and uncompelled by God or Satan, such that they alone are to be blamed for their actions. God is not shoveling the fruit into their mouth. Satan is not whipping it in with his tail and like, I got you. You accidentally ate it, and you woke up and all of a sudden you realized you were naked. No, they did it of their own accord. They alone are to be blamed for their actions. God did not infuse them with evil thoughts and desires or with an evil will. That would be God kind of willing that evil then. And here we must return to Augustine's insight that we should not look for an efficient cause of evil. It has a deficient cause, and that is like trying to see darkness or to hear silence.
Right. So here it's like, the sun illustration that we saw from Jonathan Edwards, right? The sun doesn't cause the darkness, right? Darkness is a deficiency. It happens when the sun is not there, right? The sun, the efficient effect of the sun is light and warmth, not darkness and cold, right? And so that's what he's getting at here, right?
This is nonetheless God determined Adam and Eve to fall. Thus, we cannot avoid crossing over the inscrutable nether regions here. Indeed, no theological persuasion can avoid the inscrutable realities at this point. At its core, sin is inexplicable.
And that kind of is how he attempts to solve this, right? He says basically, and of course we all know this in our hearts, that sin is inexplicable. I mean, It's ridiculous. I mean, why would we sin against a perfect, loving God, right? It just doesn't make sense. God is after our best interests. He knows our best interests. And so why in the world would we go against that? It's inexplainable, right? Why we would do something like that. And so, that's how he lands with regard to this particular problem,
right,
about Adam and Eve's sin, right? Yes, it's inexplicable why they would do something like this, So what he's done here is he said, look, sin comes from an evil heart. It's a result of our desires, right? Our intentions, that's where sin comes from. But ultimately, sin is inexplicable. And we can see this in Adam and Eve because they didn't initially have the evil heart, right? And yet they did sin, right? And so he says there's no way to explain it. Right? He ends here by saying, herein lies something to cling to, right? Nothing as monumental and consequential as the fall could have been an accident. Oops, right? They did eat the tree. No, God set all that up, right? It wasn't a risk or an unforeseen side effect of some other desirable condition. Most theologians have proposed libertarian free will as a desirable condition of pre-fall humanity. But knowing the risk of gratuitous evil, that is, evils for evil's sake or evil for no sake, right, just gratuitous evil, and its other devastation is too high a price to pay for such a brand of freedom. Right, especially since it is demonstrably unnecessary for a good world. God wouldn't allow this libertarian freedom because it's too risky, right? Too many things might happen, and so that's one of the arguments against libertarian freedom, right?
Seems like you would need to be an open theist at that point in time, and just God's reacting and he's balancing the saucers and he's spinning it and hope none of them fall. He's just a really good balancer and plate spinner.
Right, and so he says, this risk is truly inexplicable if you're coming from it from a libertarian perspective. Right.
So this points to the fall as having a grander set of divine goals that would be unrealized if it never happened.
So notice this makes the fall a good thing.
I mean,
God is trying to accomplish something through it, right?
Right. Again, there's no evil will within him, so the fall is not him cackling in the background and saying, this mankind is thinks they have it so good. Well, I'll show them.
Right.
And again, what does Scripture tell us? That's the big moniker here is, what are we pulling out of Scripture? Not what do we want to happen? What can we set as our stacking of philosophies and kind of referring to Scripture from time to time and finding a good process? What did the people that wrote the Bible understand? What did the people at the time would understand? And also referring to things of being planned before the foundation of the world, before those weird people suddenly started making their own decisions. What happened? There was already a plan in place, and so we have to deal with that. And it's a straightforward way, and it's my way is just the straightforward reading the Bible, and that's all that is. But you kind of have to deal with a lot of those in response to this.
Yeah.
So this points to the fall as having a grander set of divine goals and unrealized if it never happened. If God deliberately purposed and ensured that the fall would occur, well, why? Wouldn't the world would have been better off without it? What possible good could outweigh the devastating disease, and which evil has infected the world? Let us tune in next time as we explore an unremarkable answer to that question in the next chapter.
All right, so that's how he ends this chapter, by the way, with that cliffhanger, right? Right. What in the world, what's going on here, and why would God do that, and why would he want that, as opposed to what other worlds he could have had, right? And he says, stay tuned.
Yeah. Humanity's fallen. Will it continue to fall? There's no jump cut here that comes about in cheesy editing, really bad editing. But yes, again, chapter 9, it was one of those where if I should have went back and highlighted what I didn't want to highlight, and I had a lot of side notes that explored in my mind different aspects of and questions and other topics that brought up, and I really, really enjoyed this chapter. I really like chapter 2, but boy, chapter 9 was really good.
Yeah.
And we didn't cover it all.
Right.
And we couldn't have covered it all.
And what made it good is he started giving us some of his answers to some of these issues that we've been struggling with, right? Yeah.
We all like to complain about our boss, but once we become the boss, that's where things take place. And so here's his plan, and he's setting out his plan, starting with transcendent, and then dealing with aspects of, is God this benevolent author of evil? Well, hold on. What do you mean by author of evil? And so breaking down like that. So again, we suggest you get the book, What About Evil? A Defense of God's Sovereign Glory. Give Scott Christensen some good reviews out there if you're reading along with us. He's been on our show before and engaged very well, and we appreciate him and his work in this. And we'll see if he can pull out a theodicy, because we still don't have really a theodicy. We're staying tuned, and we're only halfway through the book, really, so more than halfway. But so hopefully you'll join us back next time as we undergo our What About Evil.
See you next time.